Hi everyone. In continuation to my series of sessions on human resource factors and the various talent management issues, one of the core areas which I haven't touched upon yet and I felt it was time to talk about, especially into these times of pandemic crisis, is about leadership. There is a whole bunch of content on leadership, and probably any of the social media or knowledge sites contain enough and more about leadership. So, hence, I felt it is important to talk about it and actually dispel certain of the myths which are associated with so called leadership. The first of the myths is the factor that leadership is often associated with a lot of emotional pronouns and adjectives. Being empathetic, being kind, being virtuous. Now, my problem with these terms is the factor that these terms as virtues need to exist not only within leaders but probably within every human being. So it's not particularly a privilege for someone to be kind only when he or she is a leader. To be kind, to be helpful, to be good natured, to be objectively oriented is something every human being should be. So it's a human uh, emotion, and it's a human factor. Now, why do I say this? This comes from what I call or what I believe to be the benchmark of understanding how do you understand whether a factor fits in or does not fit into the narrative. And that can be well described by what I call as the rule of universality, which means that when you pick up something or when someone tells you something about some data, some information, look at whether it universally fits into the framework or does it uh, provide an absolute exclusive meaning. To give you a very simple example, 2 plus 2 is 4 in India, in America, in Russia, in China, all over the world. So this is universal, it does not change, right? So similarly, goodness, kindness are human attributes, human virtues, which should be there in humans across. So that's not to be only privileged or left to leadership. That's point number one. So hence, how do we understand leadership? So to understand leadership, we have to first understand that what actually pushes or brings forth the qualities of leadership in a person. Now, a humankind or a human being expresses themselves in two ways. One is how they express themselves internally and how they express themselves to the outer world. How we express ourselves internally are human qualities. These are qualities which need to be checked for each and every human being, each and every worker, each and every employee. However, how we express ourselves to the outer world becomes more and more imperative for people in leadership positions, not because of the positions they occupy, but because of the power of influence in those positions. The number of lives that they could influence, they could activate, they could put into jeopardy, and or they could bring about a whole sea of change. And depending on how uh, worthy and how eventful and how everlasting that change is, someone would be denoted as a leader. Look at all the presidents and prime ministers and the great world leaders, and all they have done are worthy of remembrance for ages. Not all of them, of course, fit into the bill, and which is why we are particularly enamored by certain of them, and we believe they have really been impactful through their decisions, which means how they have interacted with the externality. Now, how would someone interact with the externality? It is based on internally how you are. Now, here comes the second dilemma. Often we believe that leaders have to be good, leaders have to be kind. Always remember, every action would have an equal reaction. That's in fact the law of karma. So if I can just explain the law of karma here in a little while. A lot of people misunderstand karma and think that karma is if you do something bad, it will come back to you. Actually, no. Whatever you do does involve both the good and the bad. So it's more of the Chinese yin and yang concept that even when you are consuming food for your own benefit, you are killing a plant or an animal. So you are not bereft of badness. So again, the good, kind factors which we associate are actually not true. So when a leader of a nation has to take a decision favoring their country, it would hurt the opposing nation, right? So we have to again understand that these are not factors for leaders or for understanding and realizing leadership qualities. Leadership qualities are how do we express ourselves when faced with situations, when faced with crisis, and how do we respond to them. That's where leadership qualities come out. And people who have a larger field of influence, who are able to command a larger followership based on how effective their actions or their approach were, end up being called as leaders or revered as leaders. Now, where does this area of influence work? So have a look here. We have these four things. We have ideas, we have data, we have people, and we have things. The way we interact with all these things, it highlights how we are able to take forth and bring about a whole sea of change in our reactions by keeping in mind the influential power of all these factors. So, a good leader would have to keep in mind that every situation that they come across poses a challenge in terms of both the ability to react and the power that exists outside, which could further disrupt their area of influence. So, is leadership a skill or a practice? I would say practice. It's not a skill. You keep on continuously learning it because every situation keeps evolving through times. It's also about rethinking rather than refining what you know. So, if you are able to rethink and come out with a new paradigm, you would be called as a leader rather than simply refining, which is the job of a specialist. The third factor is your openness to learning. Are you stuck in your functional role, or are you able to go beyond the functional role and learn about these factors of how ideas, data, people, and things influence. Like, say, for example, an engineer could be highly influenced by things and ideas and would not understand the impact of people in this entire uh, sphere. So it's important that you have the capability to be open to learn new things and understand them, accept them. And this is what I've spoken about in one of my videos, that one of the first things is about how we learn is about observation. So being very keenly observant is a very distinct sign of potential of leadership. What's the fourth factor? The fourth factor is to understand that leading people uh, is more of a way, a direction of life rather than simply a job role. A lot of people consider that my role begins and ends at the workplace, at the office, as a leader. Now, that's also an extreme thought. While, yes, you are subject to your managerial qualities and your managerial competencies, as a leader, you would always need to find out that can I bring about more better direction, can I provide more better ways to help out the community. The fifth big factor about leadership is to understand the clear distinction between machine and people. A lot of people get pretty bogged down and do not understand that, see, leadership is all about followers, and machines would not follow you. People would. If you do not have any followership, if people do not listen to my videos, can I be a subject leader? I can't, right? So similarly, if you do not have a set of followers, people who obey you, people who revere you, if you are not remembered through the ages or through a certain timeline, are you really a leader? You are just a subject matter expert who might have done his or her job pretty well. So, rising beyond machines or rising beyond ideas, rising beyond data, and even sometimes rising beyond people to understand that the whole responsibility needs to be taken in a forward direction is the quality of a true leader. The sixth factor is about understanding that change is not a project, it is a practice. You cannot consider that, okay, we have to change something because now the scenario has changed, so let us change it. No. Every time, if you think of how do I change my processes, my practices to make them more better, more efficient, more productive, you will end up making it as a practice rather than a project, because a project begins and ends, and after that it does not progress further, and then you go into a continuum. The seventh thing, very important to note, is you will have to move from task to trust. As a leader, one of the most effective qualities is the ability to trust people. Why should you have the ability to trust? Because if you have been a good leader, you would have ensured, first of all, to understand the capabilities of the people over whom you command, to address the learning and skill gaps, if any, complete them, and once you have tested them, you have sure about their mettle, you don't need to keep looking at the task part anymore. Very wonderfully, as they say, that you don't need to keep a dog and bark yourself. So similarly, it's very important that if you have a dog, let the dog bark. Uh, the, uh, the ninth factor is to start thinking. And here is the bigger idea. See, when you are faced with an external situation and when you actually have to show up your leadership qualities, you cannot help with just feeling for people or feeling for the situation. I feel a lot of empathy for you. I feel bad about you. That probably even my colleagues feel. What can you do about it? So that's where the thinking cap becomes more and more important. And the more you use the thinking cap, go back and think, you can change faster. You can be more open about learning. You can rethink rather than refine processes better if you start thinking rather than simply feeling. In fact, to know more about these factors of how to use the right ethics and the right value systems, it is very important to read my book, Reasoning Our Choices. It gives you a brilliant narrative of how humans think, and it has a very clear framework to help you ensure that you never fail from your path. You can build the right path, and which is where I come to my last point, which is about your values based vision. Is a values based approach important in leadership? Now, let us clear one thing over here. As I said about the law of karma, and that every good thing would also have a bad thing following it, it is very important to remember that your values will determine the path that you select, because it is not always that you have a single path to take. You would have multiple ways to go about it. And that's where your cognitive intelligence, your ability to reason better and find out about the challenges of all the multiple paths and how to choose finally one of the paths which would make the biggest amount of difference, is all about good leadership. By the way, there's nothing called true leadership. There's nothing called bad leadership. Leadership is leadership. It's a quality. You could either be a buffoon in your process. So some leaders are called out purely because, not because they are per se bad people, but probably their ideas are not strong enough or do contain a lot of the negative karma effect compared to the positivity that I spoke about. So hence it becomes important to understand that if you follow this whole path, these 10 factors, you will understand finally that leadership is about a certain way of practice, a certain kind of thinking, a certain principled approach towards being observant and using your reasoning to find out the best path going forward to be able to reach the end of the tunnel. Look at what we have done with technology. We have used so much of technology, but we have not used it for healthcare because we never felt the threat of a COVID coming and completely disrupting our lives. So we spend millions and billions of our worthy resources into making our smartphones smaller and slimmer and better, and trying to think of going to the Mars and going to the moon. Whereas we have so much of poverty, we have so much of illness, we have so much of issues to be addressed right here. And that's where global leadership is really failing us. But you can't help it, because these are the people who come to the fore. These are the people who are celebrated and who, of course, are sometimes elected through democratic processes, sometimes are nominated and sit in the high chairs and command over our lives. So understand these finer distinctions and you will find yourself not being fooled by the greatness of leadership that you see around, but are better able to distinguish the potential and the quality of a true leader. Thank you for bearing with me, and I look forward to your comments and your discussions and suggestions in this matter. We at pexisco.com conduct leadership assessments, which takes into account a portion of the situation leadership uh, diagnostic model. Along with it, of course, it covers a lot of other areas, because we realize that it is very important that when you are assessing for potential of leadership, you need to first understand the potential for managerial competency, because as I explained right at the start, what you are internally often pushes how you react to the external factor or force which throws out your leadership qualities. So that's where the yin and the yang meet. I might do a second session, so look out for the next video on this, and thank you for bearing me and listening to me.